Excellencies, dear friends and guests, I warmly welcome you at the Embassy of Latvia in Tallinn to a discussion about the role of multiculturalism and multilingualism in the resilience of the society. The idea of the discussion was developed together with the director of the Livonian Institute, Mr. Valts Ernštreits, present today, who is a Livonian himself and a poet, and my good colleagues at the Embassy of Latvia in Helsinki. I am grateful to them for support. The idea was twofold. First, to look at security from the angle of the strength or resilience of society. The case of Latvia's indigenous people, the Livonians, and how Latvia is dealing with its historical languages and cultures seemed a case worth exploring. Not least because we have a chance to compare Latvia's policy to that of Estonia. As you know, we adore comparing to each other. The latest story I saw was about bears. Estonians have calculated that Latvians would need some 50 years to get the same number of bears as in Estonia. The second reason why today's discussion is the fact that both Latvia and Estonia play a prominent role at the United Nations level as to the issues of indigenous people. Mr. Valts Ernštreits is one of the co-chairs of the UN Global Task Force for Decade of Indigenous Languages, and Mr. Sven-Erik Soosaar, senior researcher of the Estonian Language Institute, also present today, is a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Both this discussion and the Livonian Poetry Evening later today are organized in the framework of the program supporting Latvia's candidacy to the non-permanent seat of the UN Security Council for 2026-2027. And to conclude, this is really intended to be as a discussion. Please feel free to ask questions or make comments. Don't be surprised if from time to time my colleague is in front of the chimney. He's just putting some fresh firewood.
Thank you everyone for coming, and first of all thank you to our Embassy of Republic of Latvia in Estonia for organizing this. And it is, in my opinion, brilliant moment in time that we are gathering here for this discussion. As next Tuesday, there will be top-level opening of the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which will take place in Paris. And furthermore, as it was already mentioned, that Latvia is taking active role in participation of making this decade. Furthermore, in official program, a cultural program of that opening event, there will be participation, maybe for first time, on any UN level indigenous body by Livonian musicians, Yogi Stalte and her daughters. And even more, there will be ones who will open this great cultural event with Livonian traditional songs, which is a great honor for us and a great moment for making Latvia's indigenous Livonian heritage really visible on a global scale. So, but as we started to talk about the decade, so this is maybe where our discussion will take off. So I will start maybe from the first question that may be on minds of many of you. What is UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022-2032, and what it is actually about? Sven.
Thank you. Before answering you, I would also like to thank for invitation here and for all the public who has gathered here. Yes, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages was actually a continuation of the Year of Indigenous Languages, which was celebrated in 2019. And after this year was accomplished, it was clear that 1 year is not enough to achieve all these goals that were set ahead for us. So on UN level, especially UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and also other UN entities decided that there is a need for a decade where the broader society and all the member states of UN could participate and change, make some change, because as we know, a lot of languages, mostly indigenous languages, are endangered. They are losing speakers. Many languages are on the verge of extinction. So something has to be made. So that's the first reason why the decade was started, and in the aims and purposes why this decade was started was that to make the broader society more aware of this problem, and that all the different stakeholders could take part to improve the situation. Of course, the main stakeholders who can do changes are the governments of the, but also the indigenous people themselves and all the other like big international companies should be also involved, because we in our society we need support, technical support from all digital devices that are not used by that are used by also by indigenous peoples, but they cannot use their languages there. So there are a lot of different areas where indigenous languages could be used, but are not used, and that's a main problem. That the use of indigenous languages is very limited. The areas where they can be used, but we have to make a situation where indigenous languages could be used in more areas.
I will a little bit comment on one thing that might seem confusing, and there has been discussion also in Estonia, I guess, when the decade was first announced, about like who are indigenous. That is the term which sometimes puts people in confusement, and especially in Estonia there were arguments like, well, we are Estonians, we are living here for so many years, so aren't we indigenous? Basically, maybe this term is not the brightest one in this kind of global approach, but putting things simple, indigenous language is language that is spoken in this particular place for a very, very long time, and which is not kind of majority language of the state or the region it's located in. And why this indigenous, well, this is my way of simplifying stuff.
Actually, I think mostly indigenous language is defined through the indigenous peoples. That indigenous language is a language that is spoken by indigenous peoples for a long time, or their original language.
Yeah. So and why it is important, why this decade maybe specifically acts on indigenous languages is that and these are under the focus because it's really a question of diversity. So there are around 7,000 or now less languages in the world. A majority of these languages are actually indigenous. They are most of them they are endangered or critically endangered. There are some languages, maybe 100, 200, which are like state language level, which are safe, like Estonian, like Latvian. These are, in the world scale, these are actually languages in pretty good condition, and we cannot like really compare the endangerment of these with indigenous languages. But it is like crucial thing is to really keep that diversity, linguistic diversity, and therefore also cultural diversity, because language is not only a form of communication. It is something that carries much more in it. So it carries culture, it carries traditional lifestyles, traditional understanding of the world. And when language dies, much more is actually lost than just words that people communicate in. And in that sense, this International Decade of Indigenous Languages is not only trying specifically kind of look towards only and exclusively indigenous languages, but also to promote the linguistic diversity and cultural diversity in a broader sense. And sometimes I'm comparing this with nature, with the way how we approach environmental issues. And this is something that we have already used to. So we know that it is important that not only pine trees grow in Estonian forests, but there's sometimes an oak would be good, or an apple tree. And we have used to protecting nature is important, protecting extinct species are important. So governments agree to invest money to build preservation areas for different species. However, the understanding that within the humanity, languages and cultures must be protected as well, because they are also of a value for the world and for the world to be diverse and to be actually interesting place to live in.
Yeah, it's true that also in this document on indigenous decade of indigenous languages, the program, it's also one of the main reasons is also that many of the indigenous languages are spoken in the areas of the world which are also hotspots of biological diversity, where many species are living, and sometimes this leads also in some conflict, because the environmental activists and are protecting nature, but they don't think they are not thinking that indigenous peoples are living in this the same areas where these endangered species are living. So while trying to protect endangered animal species, they sometimes make harm to indigenous peoples and languages also. So there has to be, we have to find some balance where both indigenous peoples and languages can thrive, and in cooperation or with this nature, their ecological environment where they have been living for centuries.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the key questions that should be answered during this decade. So kind of finding a balance between protecting nature, protecting also gaining resources, because let's remember that indigenous people usually are settled in areas which are rich in resources, and kind of a finding of balance between those two things. So with this, we actually are getting to our next question. So what is because always if something is done, then there is probably something in mind, like where will we want to reach out to, and what outcome do we expect from that? So what is that outcome that we are expecting to get from this decade?
Of course, the main goal that is set for the decade, this decade is that there, in the end of this decade, there will be more speakers of indigenous languages, and the status of indigenous languages would be higher. They could be used in more areas of human activity. So for this, we need to develop legislation, to adopt laws that would protect indigenous languages in the countries where they are spoken. But also there is a need for digital development of languages, because many indigenous languages do not even have literacy, or if they do, their alphabets or how they write, it is not supported by the programs that are run on computers or other digital devices. So we need support from governments, we need support from big tech companies, and we need support from all the indigenous peoples themselves also must be interested in this. Mostly they are, but also the broader society should be more favorable, because nowadays in many countries indigenous peoples are how to say, their status in their countries is pretty low. They are not valued like members, full members of society, and this is also in many cases because they are not able to participate in this life of society if they do not speak the official language, or and there are not services for them in their own language. So this is there are a lot of challenges that have to be faced.
So if we look at the plan that has been developed for the decade, then maybe what Sven already told, so there are those aspects that are included, and Sven already pointed out one aspect, which is legislation on status, which is very important for many indigenous languages, so to be simply recognized and not giving something special, but at least being recognized as languages that exist and indigenous people that exist in that country. So, or the region. So this status issue is one thing, and that leads to greater awareness in the community and greater and therefore also greater understanding of the problems of and issues that indigenous people have to tackle. Another aspect, huge aspect, is actually education. How to not see only education, but in a more broader sense, language transition, because that is something, language transmission, that is something that is very strongly affected by today's world. So Usually indigenous people in one way or another are very exposed to majority cultures, majority languages, and then in many cases it's a matter of choice whether you take easy part and become member of a majority society and abandon your indigenous background, or you kind of try to keep, but that requests additional effort. And this is where the education is really, really important, and not only teaching and learning languages in educational system, but also education of the society about why is this necessary. Another aspect that Sven already touched is the digital aspect, and in a sense I think in Latvia, in Estonia and other countries, we're starting to notice that there are actually two countries of each that exist. So one country is that with physical borders that we cross, that we live in, that we go to the shops to, and then another country is this virtual country where there are people scattered all around the world, but they still remain part of the same community. They living in Brazil watch Latvian news. They are corresponding with people in the United States or Australia, but in Latvian. So this is another virtual Latvia that has already born. And considering indigenous people, if we look around the world on those very different situations, there have been voices specifically from those indigenous people who still live in isolated and remote areas, that we're not really interested in those digital kind of talks and digital things. Maybe that's kind of a first world problems that you are dealing with, but it's completely not true, because it's a question of time. So 20 years ago, we didn't have internet here as well, in the levels that we are using it now. We didn't have like social networking, we didn't have this overwhelming informational space. And for every indigenous language of the world, it's a question of time. So 10, 20, 30 years, they'll be faced with the same huge and global informational space. And whether there will be a place for their language is something that they have to start think already now, today. And this is what those who are better developed on digital issues are able to help others, those who inevitably will become part of the same world. And so that is really, really important aspect. And during the decade already is 10 years, so it means that
11 years. 11 years
11 actually, technically 11, so formally 10 as a decade. And then there is like one extremely important aspect, and I would say that maybe the most important aspect of the decade is self-consciousness of indigenous people. Because the basic principle of UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, adopted in 2007, signed by, I think, all countries apart North Korea, and there was one other country who didn't sign it. The basic core principle in the declaration is nothing for us without us. So that no decisions on the lands of indigenous people, or culture, or language, or legislation status can be made without involving indigenous people. But from the perspective of the decade, and from the perspective of keeping the linguistic diversity of the indigenous world and of world as such, the most important thing is communities of speakers, and whether they are able and willing to keep their language, their identity, their culture. Because nobody can come and tell us what and how it should be done. And if there is no will of people, then we can throw money, we can do whatever efforts. If people don't want, the language will die, the culture will die. So the core is willingness of the people, and this is, I think, that this decade has to achieve, is that providing indigenous people the understanding of their value, and providing with reasons for the need for themselves to keep their heritage.
Yeah, that's true. And in the target groups, there are several target groups in the program for the decade, but the main target group are the children and youth, because they are the future generation who has to bring these languages to the future generations, and also language teachers, translators, all who are on or should develop the languages, and this is where also the education comes in, as in this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There is also one article on education, that the indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages. So this is one of the crucial things, that there should be educational system that either provides indigenous people with a possibility to learn their language in schools, or even grant them their own schools in their own language. Of course, it depends on the local possibilities and circumstances, but this is also where the legislations comes in. You may have a great legislation, but if you do not actually follow this legislation and make efforts to fulfill that's promised or that is made possible by law, then only law does not change anything. So we have seen that, for example, in Russian Federation there are, or at least there were, quite good laws that should had protected the languages, but if they are not used, so we see that what is the result, and that law itself does not change anything. So we have to make the laws to actually act and make it possible to use these rights that are given by the law.
Now also my personal belief is that understanding is the main thing if you want to realize something. That just as Sven-Erik said, like you can have the best laws in the world, but if people don't really understand what they are for or what they are about, then it's very hard to make change. So you have to kind of this is where the good decision starts, in my opinion, is if the decision is not made because of the law that says that, but because you understand why it is needed. And that is also something that decade should take care about. So now I guess that we turn a little bit different direction. from here. And usually when people talk about indigenous people, especially sometimes in Latvia, if we try to explain to, for example, to school children, like who are indigenous people, then best examples that usually work are America. So First Nations of America, Indians, people know that very well. So okay, that's indigenous, yes, that we understand. Then Australia, Aboriginal people, people again understand, okay, so they are they are different looking, they are different traditions, so yes, we understand it, like how the difference is. Then we go to Sami, which are now already in Europe. And then, okay, so we have seen those stories about Santa Claus coming from Sami lands, and yeah, okay, so reindeer, and that's something that we understand. And then we try to explain, well, okay, now we come to Latvia, and now the same people as in America. So if you have First Nations in America or Aboriginal people of Australia, some is for Finland, and in Latvia we actually have Livonians. So that's the very same. That's the very same thing. And the question is like, how do we really talk in the European context, in the European Union context, about indigenous people and the indigenous problematics?
Yeah. Now we come again back to this question: who is an indigenous people? So really, actually, on even in UN level, there is no strict definition of indigenous peoples, because there is wide variety in the world who are indigenous peoples. So there are some properties that the indigenous peoples usually have, but this is not a strict definition. So there is also already on the highest level there is not a definition. So you cannot strictly say that this is indigenous and this is not. And so it's always there is like a level of you can in local context you can define it differently, but indeed one of the properties that usually are assigned to indigenous peoples is that they are still living in a traditional way, and that's why Samis are usually and widely considered as indigenous, because they are, or at least some of them are still reindeer herders, and they live in traditional way. So, but for example, Basques who are living in France and in Spain, they are not. Maybe also some of them live in traditional way, but they are not so different from the other population in their way of life from Spaniards or French people. But Samis are different, and they are living in a traditional way. So in this sense, we might ask also about Livonians. Is it are they living in traditional way, or is it not applicable to Livonians in this? We know that before the Second World War, Livonians mainly lived in traditional way, but this was violently disrupted, this way of living. So I think that this property is not applicable in every situation, but I will let you comment on this, but I will also shortly tell more about this indigenous peoples in European Union, as sometimes also the Greenlandic Inuits are also told that they are indigenous, but of people of Europe. But as we know, Greenland is actually geographically taken, it is part of Northern America, and also although Denmark is part of European Union, Greenland is a special territory that does not belong to European Union. So technically speaking, Greenlandic people, they are usually considered as an indigenous people, and their language as an indigenous language, but not usually as a European indigenous peoples and language. Sami and Livonians that are considered as indigenous peoples of Europe or European Union. So I will let you comment on what do you think on are Livonians and indigenous or not?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Considering Sami, Livonian as well is one another factor. So beyond this kind of core discussion of the features, or of the definition, both Samis and Livonians are officially recognized by their countries as indigenous people. And this is something that also adds to the status, because Livonians have been first recognized as indigenous nation of Latvia in 1991, already in law of cultural autonomy, and then almost at the same moment of time also recognized in the state language law, this first version. And in current state language law, there is clearly chapter on the Livonian indigenous status. In this kind of Latvia's legislation system, we have in Latvia two languages. There is a state language and version of the state language Latgalian, which is spoken in Eastern Latvia, and then Livonian, which is the second language officially recognized in the state law, but it's recognized as an indigenous, autochthonous language of Latvia, and all the other languages except Latvian with Latgalian and Livonian are considered kind of foreign languages, or the second languages. So this is this official recognition is one fact that might have skipped in many cases when people speak about being indigenous in Europe. So about this traditional lifestyle, so this is what I think where the real worth of Livonian experience comes in, because as you mentioned, so Livonians have faced quite harsh history. Livonian is really very old language and nation. In terms of our, especially in Northern Europe, so Livonians have been living in Latvia since times immemorial. So first time Livonian was written down in already in 13th century. So there are first phrases, first names, first place names in Livonian written down. Basically, history of Latvia starts with story, the first chronicle, major chronicle about Latvia is a story about Livonians and their neighbors. So there's German traders coming to Livonian lands, and then Christianization and war starts. And And well, this is where the story of Latvia begins as well. And what has happened throughout the history is that Livonians have, on one hand, they have melted with other tribes of the Latvian area and formed this kind of a new nation, like relatively new nation called Latvians, which have both of these codes in it. So Baltic code or Indo-European code and Livonian or Finnic code. But throughout the history, Livonian has somehow managed to keep their identity, their traditional lifestyle, their language through those 1,000 years. And if we look at 19th, 20th century, Livonians have not been large in numbers. So mid-19th century, 2,500 people. This is, I think, Estonian village by its size. But nevertheless, Livonian is still spoken in the living tradition today. But what kept Livonians for that long time was not only their strong identity, but also geographical isolation. Because the last place where the Livonians lived was, one area was the northern part of Kurland Peninsula, so it was geographically isolated part, almost an island, which doesn't look as an island on maps, but geographically it's isolated from inland. So, and this was the place that kept Livonians alive for that long, and that helped to keep alive the traditions, language, and everything. And that's something. And this isolation is, as I think, it's one aspect that is keeping alive majority of indigenous people and indigenous languages in the world. So even Samis are isolated geographically. So there are so vast areas between, so there are compact settlements when they live together, and this isolation is very good for conserving something and like keeping it. So what Livonians faced in 20th century was that this almost island-like part of Latvia suddenly became very important. So the First World War, it suddenly turned into front lines. So Livonians were kicked out entirely from their area. They came back, and in the Second World War, the same thing happened. They were kicked out, and then they came back. And in 50s, under the Soviet occupation, the border regime was introduced in Livonian areas, and Livonians were forced to leave from there. And up until that time, up until 50s, 60s, Livonians really still had this very traditional, like kind of full scale of what indigenous should be. Mm-hmm. So with traditional lifestyle, with all the traditional culture events and everything. So from that time on, Livonians have been living scattered across the Latvia, and somehow, even in this exile, keeping their identity and keeping their language. So in a sense, what we see in Livonian case is that we live in future society. In Livonian case already, if we like comparing with Samis or in those people who might be living in isolation in Amazonas or in other places. So and Livonians kind of became as a virtual society. They adapted to this kind of new world even before the internet arrived. Mm-hmm. So and that is, I think, that what is very extremely valuable experience for other indigenous people, because we really are living and we are trying to keep that continuation and build the future for Livonians in the future circumstances. So we are kind of ahead, 50, 60 years ahead of others. So there are experiences that we are getting now that we can actually transfer to other people. And I think that, and today, if we look at this place and the numbers of Livonians of today, so this is a very small community, extremely small compared to the world. So there are official data, that's all the official data, but there were 250 Livonians altogether, and something around 20 language speakers, which is not much. But then again, if you look at the summer schools that take place every year in the Livonian coast, you see 50 children and kids, which is like limited selection who are able to participate, and that is kind of number which is unproportionally big. You have in this small community, you have 8 different singing and music groups performing, which is again unproportional. You have 3 poets out of 20 language speakers, which is unproportional. You have, and that is not just like people writing, putting together some words. It's really quality poetry which has been awarded by different institutions. So there is kind of, and for me, being Livonian myself, it is really interesting, this taking and understanding better what lies in the core of that kind of resilience that has helped Livonians to go through the history. Because again, 2,500, which is nothing even in our terms, and yet 150 years later, still they are around. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
It was long.
Yeah, thank you for this very long and
Livonians are very long.
Interesting explanation. But yeah, that's true. You mentioned also isolation. That's also one of the main challenges that we have to face. That in many places, indigenous peoples who have been isolated are not anymore so isolated. And indigenous peoples move to cities. There is a process of urbanizations going on. So we have to find a way how to survive in how these languages and people can survive in the new environment and that's where the digital devices may help. To develop a new kind of virtual society where people are dispersed, but they can still interact and use their languages using digital devices. That's one important thing that during this will be addressed during this decade also. But you are also talking about Latvia. It's some way understandable why then Latvia is so interested in participation in indigenous issues. Is it true that is it because of Livonians living in Latvia or other reasons for that?
Well, there are like Livonians is definitely one thing that is important for Latvia, because the Livonian experience is something that can be used for and also experience in building digital solutions and tackling digital issues. And there are actually very many examples that could be taken from this kind of past hundreds of years of Livonian life and transferred and kind of offered to others. But I think another thing why Latvia is so much interested in this decade is that Latvia has always been culturally and linguistically very diverse. If we look at the different borders crossing Latvia, that there are numbers of those borders. So Latvia is not as homogeneous as most of the countries of Northern European Union. Latvia has, so there is this Finnic heritage alongside within the European heritage. You have half of one part of country being Catholic, another part being Lutheran. You have like so big mixture of different cultures and different heritages in Latvia together. So it is very important kind of to value all it. And in this sense, this dealing with something that is connected with this linguistic and basically also a cultural diversity, identity diversity, is something that can be also very useful, vice versa, for Latvia, to develop the resilience of the country, to develop kind of the better understanding and better valuing of those aspects the country has.
Yeah, that's interesting because Estonia has also been very active in indigenous issues on international level, and but Estonia maybe we have a little bit different reason, because we have been active because of our Finno-Ugric heritage, and there were, this is where the this Finno-Ugric dimensions come in, because we are in, Estonia is a Finno-Ugric language, and we are very concerned about the other smaller Finno-Ugric languages that are spoken mainly in Russian Federation, but also in Nordic countries, Saamis and Livonian in Latvia. So Estonia has been active on this issue, and we are also been actively participating in UN level. We have been donors for different initiatives that are trying to support indigenous peoples and their development. But of course, we should also, on this issue, we should mention the Seto people who have declared themselves as indigenous people, but this is so far not been recognized by the Estonian state. So here also comes this issue, how the indigenous people should be defined in different countries, and this is also a question of not only terminology, but it's also a question of legislation. How, although we are supporting all Estonian government or is supporting the development of different local variants of Estonian language. So we have produced. I myself am working in the Institute of Estonian Language, where we have produced several dictionaries of local variants of Estonian, and yeah, Estonia is very interested in indigenous issues because of this Finno-Ugric heritage, but is it also an issue in Latvia, or how?
Well, in Latvia we have kind of the understanding that Latvia partially also with one foot is a little bit belonging to this Finno-Ugric world, so they're just starting to develop. Because maybe this knowledge about Livonian footprints in Latvian language and even modern culture is not there. By the way, just yesterday, Livonian Institute, together with Latvian UNESCO branch, declared year 2023 Year of Livonian Heritage, which is aiming precisely at that. So kind of making Livonian heritage in Latvia more visible. But in that sense, Latvia as a country has not been that much involved in Finno-Ugric cooperation. However, Livonians have been participating and are now participating. There is quite a lot of collaboration in this kind of Livonian framework. So there are events organized by Finno-Ugria in Latvia, for example. There are extremely lots of cooperation between Estonian scientific institutions like your institute, especially University of Tartu, and now our institute in Latvia. So there has been quite a lot of collaboration of that kind, but maybe not on this kind of a political level. So we have entered from little bit different perspectives, but the main thing is that we actually meet at the same places at UNESCO.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, but I know that in Latvia there has recently been adopted a new law, a law of Latvian historical lands. What is it, and how does it correlate with historical lands and issues of Livonians, and which are obviously not Latvians? So.
Well, that was one thing that I wanted to continue what you talked previously about Seto people and about Estonian language. There's always this kind of issue. So, which comes first? Regulation in the form of law, or the support systems in the form and an understanding in the form of actual action. From a little bit going back to the Livonian case, so in late 70s, the Soviet Union erased Livonians from the name of the lists of from the list of nations of the Soviet Union, and it meant that you couldn't get your nationality Livonian in passport, although nationality was written, but if you wanted to write Livonian, so there was no option, so you had to choose something else, and that was legislation issue. And then when Latvia was restored, so Livonians suddenly, when the independence of Latvia was restored, Livonians suddenly faced this problem that, well, in order to put this nationality in Latvian passport, you should have had all the documents with this Livonian nationality. And as it was forbidden by the Soviet institutions, so you couldn't show any document where this nationality was. So it was a problem for people, even after the restoration of this independence, kind of to get their nationality. And then there were like kind of two approaches for one part of people. It was very important to get this kind of legislation in place so that we can write it in. And then there was another part of society who said like, well, what's written in my passport doesn't change who I am. And that is this kind of those two aspects that are there. Coming back to this new law that was introduced last year, this is, I think, this is something very significant for Latvia as such. And I think that it is kind of reflection of today's tendencies, that we more and more value this linguistic and cultural diversity. And for Latvia, that valuing on a state level really started from the introduction of that law, which was initially it was meant to be something that helps to solve problems made by administrative reform, which means that those administrative structures were made in Latvia, and cultural spaces and people with the same identity were in many cases cut in half, just like it is in Setomaa, for example, in other places in Estonia, where you have this kind of cultural space and people with the same identity, same language, and then there are two different municipalities administering that. And but it evolved into something bigger. It's something that, on a state level, recognizing, and on the legislation level, recognizing that what we basically that there is not that being Latvian and is not kind of some middle result of everything that you have in Latvia, but it is some of all the peculiarities, all the different cultural manifestations, all the different language variations, and every single place, every single cultural space, every single area and identity is important from the perspective of Latvia as a country. So basically it's a huge turn in a sense that, and also language-wise, so there was for a very long time in Estonia and in Latvia and in other countries as well, is this, that we are looking towards, like, there is one right language, and then there are many languages which are not okay, which are like kind of sound funny and which are just shouldn't be spoken at all. And now it's like kind of a big turn that there is actually all this is valuable. And for Latvia, this is what this law actually says, is that you value all these things and you must cooperate. Even if there are two different municipalities, it should not affect the identity of the people living across them. And from Livonian perspective, this law is especially important because it was, it is called with the name might sound strange because it is it says Latvian historical lands, but basically it's a reference to our constitution, which was accepted in 1920, but it really talks about this kind of historical identities, and it has a special part in it that specifically says that alongside Latvian historical areas, it is important to safeguard indigenous Livonian heritage, and it's also the first law in Latvia's history that really says, precisely defines that Latvians are born from those ancient tribes living in Latvia plus indigenous Livonian population. So basically first law that points out that Livonians are not only something separate, but also part of what Latvia is today, of the Latvian code.
So the situation of Livonians should improve in view of this law. But I know that you had a kind of a art project that you put some road signs in Livonian. Will, in the light of this law, will in the nearest future will there be road signs in Livonian lands, also in Livonian language?
Yeah, and that has been one big breakthrough with this law, and with also those Livonian activities with Livonian signs, that the next year there will be signs in Livonian in this Livonian area, and then which is interesting thing is that there will, and already started appear those signs in Eastern Latvia, in Eastern Latvian variety, or Latgalian. And the law also offers opportunities to use historical signs, those brown ones, showing historical names of places, like, for example, in Vidzeme Livonian, in that variation, or in whatever Latvian dialect, or for example, in Ivrit, if it is a place with a Jewish heritage, or some other these historical connections, that also that opportunity also will be there, because there is this general idea of valuing all the heritage that we have, and everything that is connected with Latvia historically and being created in this area. But yeah, we do expect this in spring now, physically.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, coming back again a little bit now for, we have already discussed quite many aspects of indigenous issues, but what, by your opinion, what are the key challenges today, considering indigenous people of the world?
I think that one of the main challenges is that I also already mentioned, that there is like we know, there is going on globalization, and that means for indigenous peoples also urbanizations, that they move to cities, and this is completely new environment for them, and they are a small minority in these cities or larger villages, and while living on isolated in places far from big centers, they have maintain their languages, but now when they get into contact with main national groups in their countries, like it has been actually similarly like it was in Latvia with Livonians who had to move to bigger cities. That is going on in many countries in the world right now, and the challenge is how to support these people to maintain their languages in these new environments, and there is where governments have to address this problem and support this, we could say, inner diaspora, where different groups of indigenous peoples are coming together, and they are switching to this main language, may it be Spanish or English or French or some Russian. We have seen it happening already in Russia, where languages have disappeared when people have moved into cities, and they have maintained the language only if they stay their villages, and they don't have contact with or close contact with main authorities and main nationality. So this is the problem that has to be somehow we have to find a solution. If this is not if we don't find a solution for that, then we can say that in a few decades there is not 7,000 languages, but they will be maybe 4,000 or 3,000 languages left. So there are thousands of languages that are endangered because of this social processes that are going on. But what is your view on this?
Yeah, well, basically exposure to the global world is like to urban populations, and that is one definitely thing that has to be tackled. The second is finding motivation, because that is something. If you find the motivation, it might help you, but finding it is very, very complicated. and really it is a matter of individual choice in very many cases. So you have to find your individual reason for keeping your language and using your language, especially if your language is so endangered that you seldomly meet someone to talk with, and this is where the digital solutions might help. And the third thing is resources, because those those especially endangered and critically endangered languages, they suffer from lack of resources, not only to speakers, but from all kind of. So digital solutions, financing, research, and it is very complicated to really get them. And what is also important, that in society there is kind of this statistical understanding or statistical perception of needs. So this is like, if you have a language with 3 million speakers, so this is that much of money. If you have a language with 3,000 speakers, it probably means that you can give 1,000 times less, because it's like spoken by 1,000 times less people. But that's not true, because like every language needs the same core, is the same core of needs is the same. So if you, for example, if we want to teach Livonian in Latvia, so it requires a teacher, and that teacher does not. So requirement for a teacher doesn't change if it has 2 students or 200 students. But still, there is the need to be for at least 1 teacher, and you cannot pay 30 euros per year just because of the proportion. And that is something that also needs to be overcome in that very sense. But speaking of challenges, there is one challenge that actually worries me, especially for now we come down to our region here where we live, and we started to speak about Finno-Ugric dimension of Estonian, and also Finno-Ugric dimension of Livonians, is that those issues that are considering indigenous people and which are connected to the current ongoing war in Ukraine. We quite much see this one aspect. We see sufferings that Ukraine is having, and but there is one other aspect that worries me as well from the indigenous perspective, is that if we look at conscripts being sent on Ukrainian front lines from the Russian side, there are very many, and there is very high percentage of those indigenous people who are conscripted and who are sent to war, and basically it is something that directly affects those indigenous people living in Russia, affects Finno-Ugric people who already suffer from loss of language speakers, and now they are getting literally killed. And this is something that we thought that such a major thing, a major problem, is already kind of, well, local conflicts take place regularly, but something that major seemed like a distant past. But now it has come back, and that worries me a lot.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, Russia is not the first country who uses indigenous peoples in their own interest and sends them into wars that are not do not in any way are not in any way in their interest, and they are. But indeed, we have to on international level also to bring this issue up in every possibility, because actually Russian Federation is using this international decade of indigenous language as a kind of possibility for their state propaganda declaring how they are supporting indigenous peoples in Russia, how they are developing their languages and spending money on it. But this is all kind of Potemkin village that they are. This money is not actually bringing any making their lives better, because if you give with one hand something little and then send the same people to die in Ukraine, this is very strange and cruel way to act. I know that the next week there will be this opening of the International Decade, and I hope that this venue will not be used for this kind of I would say propaganda.
Okay, thank you. Diano.